going to be all right, I had told her, and it was, more or less. She ended up with a cast on her leg from the hip down to her ankle, and I have to do 2 hours of physical therapy each weekday for the next couple of months. My car was destroyed. My wife only speaks to me when she absolutely has to, because she blames me for every bit of what happened to our daughter and everything else on me, and I guess she has the right to, but it's going to be all right eventually. At least I hope it will. We've had a tradition in our house ever since our daughter was 2 years old. Once a month, we have a family adventure where we go and do something that we've never done before. It doesn't have to be big or an expensive thing. It just has to be something new and different. And you would think that would be easily accomplished with so much being available to everyone these days. You can't turn on a television or a radio that someone isn't shouting and blasting at you to go here and do this or go there and experience that. Those are the type of things my wife and daughter tend to go after. Now, they enjoy doing things that their friends have done so they can talk back and forth about it and compare notes. I don't blame them. They get a real kick out of doing that. And in all honesty, most of the time the weekends they have planned turn out to be a lot more fun than I would have originally thought them to be after hearing what we were going to be doing. Driving 2 hours to go ziplining for an hour is not something I would have come up with, but it turned out to be fun. A full day of picking blackberries and then making them into jelly wasn't, at least not for me. But any time an event has finished and I can look around in the car and see my wife and daughter smiling and laughing and talking a mile a minute about the fun they had, well, I'll take 2 out of 3 as a win every single time. I could be having the worst time in the world all day long, but if those two are happy, then it was a complete win. On the other side of the coin, though, is that they don't always see things the same way I do. They don't feel so fortunate after some of the choices I've made for our outings. So I've learned to let them make most of the selections and planning. But now and again I will have an idea and I just know it will be a home run. It usually isn't, but I keep on swinging. You can't hit the ball out of the park if you never swing at it, right? An entire weekend panning for gold in a creek and spending the nights in an authentic cabin that had no electricity, no running water, and no indoor bathroom had been a huge swing and miss. The 2 days of hunkering in bushes with paperback field guides and binoculars just to see how many different birds we could identify, well, that had been another disaster. Me forgetting the cans of bug repellent hadn't helped a bit. The worst was when I wrangled us spots in a Pioneer Village attraction. For a fee, they will let you dress up like pioneers and work in the village while other tourists walk around and watch you work. Well, I was a blacksmith's apprentice, and it was great. Jan, my wife, was a candle maker. I didn't stop hearing about the burns from the hot wax on each of her fingertips for weeks. And our daughter, Britt, her name is Brittany, but we call her Britt, was allowed to swing a long stick with a wire paddle attached to the end of it and beat the dust out of rugs for 2 days. Well, that weekend had been a gigantic swing and a miss, but how they laughed and teased over what a doofus I was made the whole thing a great memory. There was a lot of laughing going on about that trip and many of the ones that had preceded it, but there isn't much laughing going on now. 2 of us are too busy trying to heal, and the other is still too frightened and angry about what could have happened to find any reason to smile. Thinking about what might have been still scares me nearly to death. How, in an effort to show someone a good time, I almost cost her her life. They are allowed to break down and be terrified and cry, and it's good for them to get that out of their system whenever they can, but I'm not allowed that. I have to be strong for them, and I have to be the one they can lean on. All of this was my fault. I have this friend. No, that's not exactly right. I know a guy that I work with. I have no idea why the son of a gun ever owns a house because he's never there. And when the clock hits 5 at work on Fridays, he's running to his truck to go spend the weekends out doing something harebrained. He thinks that he's some sort of modern-age Tarzan. There isn't a trail in the woods or a hill somewhere that he hasn't wanted to climb or hike. And he lives on energy drinks and granola, and he's built like a steel cable. He's all the time shooting off down some river in his kayak with his fishing pole, or he's jumping off a cliff hanging onto a hang glider. Now, he says he has a life wish rather than a death wish, but I think he's about half out of his mind. But he always has great stories to tell on Monday. So I went and I hit him up for some ideas that I thought a much lazier man and his wife and 13-year-old daughter might enjoy. I didn't want to climb up the sides of the Egyptian pyramid or dodge anacondas in some South American river, but nice, fun, easy things that weren't so likely to get us killed. I also knew that he would give me a dozen or more, and I was just hoping that one or two might be something that I could use. He rattled off a couple of things off the top of his head, but he promised that he would make me out a list by the next day, and that's what he did. Some of the things he wrote down I would have said were too dangerous for those airborne soldiers to try, but a couple of suggestions didn't sound half bad. Now I wish now that I had wadded up his list and thrown it away before looking it over the second time, but I didn't. About 2 hours driving from where we live, he knew about a parcel of property that belonged to a corporation, but it was overseen by a friend of his. Now, there wasn't much to oversee because nothing was going on the property, so the man usually just did a drive-by once every so often. The property had been bought for future development, but so far there were no plans to start doing anything with it. It was too costly and the risks were too high to start any real work on the property at that time, but what made the development so risky was what also made the property so interesting. He told me that he went there often to just hike around and have a few looks. With a call, he could probably get permission for me and my family to go and do the same. I should have taken a pass right then, but I asked him to make the call. And the next weekend, we set out for an adventure like we had never had. And I hope God forgives me for what I took my family into. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. The drive turned out to be closer to 3 hours instead of 2, mainly because we started getting into the much less populated areas and the lack of state-maintained road, and there weren't any signs anywhere. We had to guess and fumble our way along through the directions that he had given me, which weren't exactly precision-filled. But because of the idea I had come up with for the month's excursion being a pretty good one, or so I thought at the time, I had taken a day off from work to make it a 3-day weekend. My hope was that it would be so great that we would have the greatest time for 3 days, and if it wasn't, we could ditch it all early and salvage part of the weekend by doing something else. So after a long and confusing drive that Friday morning, we finally found a goat path that my guy had called the road we were supposed to take into the property. Even though both my wife and my daughter were well aware of the fact that we would be camping outdoors, they still managed to look surprised and put out when they opened the car doors and there weren't any bathrooms visible. They carried on for a bit and then darted behind trees and clumps of bushes to commune with nature. And then we all pitched in and had a great time of setting up our tent and chairs. And all in all, I was considering the weekend off to a great start. And judging by all the giggling between my gals as we were doing it, they were having a good time. Things couldn't have started out much better. When the curious squirrel came up and immediately befriended Britt, everything got perfect. Britt had a buddy now, and my wife was glad to admit that I had finally done good with a plan. And we spent the afternoon taking pictures and eating sandwiches and telling stories and enjoying being with each other in the quiet where everything smelled fresh and pine-scented. My wife and I held hands as we laid in the tent in our sleeping bags, and we listened to our daughter as she whistled lowly. She doesn't snore, she whistles. She always has. And we both fell asleep listening to her. I was ready to head out as soon as I woke up, but my wife insisted on me building up the fire so she could make us all breakfast. It was when I saw their faces after I told them why exactly that we had come to this particular place that my home run was in serious jeopardy of turning into a game ending out caught on the warning track. The reason for the delay in developing this property was twofold. Half of the property was going to be terribly expensive to do anything with because it was made up in large by swampy bog-type areas that flooded in the spring rains and then never drained like most ground did. Had it been an acre or two, well, that was one thing, but this property consisted of many more times that amount of acreage. The other half of the property was dry because it consisted of the hardwood uplands and ridges that surrounded the lower, swampier areas. It was not as easy to work with because of the way that the land laid, and dangerous and expensive to try anything because parts of it was littered with caves, 14 that my guy was aware of. He was sure that there were more that he had not yet discovered. Whoever had bought the property had been lax in doing their homework first, but my guy had done his, and now I had a map to every cave that he knew about. I thought a bit of spelunking for a couple of days might roll their socks up and down, but the looks on their faces when I made the announcement assured me that I was mistaken. It took me 30 minutes to convince them to trust me and give this at least a genuine try. And seeing that I was losing the battle in the war, I resorted to something that I was highly effective, but that I'm in no way proud of. I began listing the monthly adventures that we had taken, but that they had planned that were heavily centered around the fairer sex having the most enjoyment. And I had gone along and said nothing, and even paid for the experiences, and even though men were a distant second place on the scale of making sure that the visitor had a swell time. The wreath-making, from wild grapevines and flower-arranging trip had been the first one that I brought up, and that started them to staring at their shoes. But by the time I got to the weekend of painting on old bits of wood and rocks with brushes made from broom sage and tufts of hand-spun wool, they were in complete agreement that it was time that old Dad had a chance to grin, and they promised me that they would dodge the bats and the mole crickets and never protest. All that mattered was that I had a good time looking around in dirty and damp old caves. Well, I knew it was a promise they would not keep, but they had finally agreed to go, and so we set off. The first one that we finally discovered did not help my case in the least. Instead of the underground wonders that I had promised, we found an alcove in the side of a hill that wasn't much larger than my daughter's walk-in closet. Someone taking a chunk of rock heavy in limestone and scratching the words "Frampton comes alive" on the wall only caused them to roll their eyes at each other. And the fact that it had been so long ago when Frampton was actually a thing went right over their heads, and I scored no points for pointing it out to them. So I put on my most optimistic face and led the way to the next one. I never could tell exactly what they were whispering to each other as they both talked behind me, but I'm sure that I had heard my wife tell Britt just to humor me, and this time tomorrow that we would be on our way back home and we could probably stop for pizza along the way. Well, I walked just that much faster after hearing that exchange. Over the course of the next hour, we found 3 more of the caves on the map that I had been given, and one was no bigger than the first one that we had found, if it was even that big, and the other 2 you could actually walk inside and look around. You couldn't do much more than that, but we were finally all 3 in a cave, and I could see the interest beginning to grow. At least on Britt's face I did. My wife is definitely not a fan of caves. But she gutted it out and came inside and did rather well, so long as she could be near the entrance. Thankfully, we found no graffiti on the walls and no litter aside from a shed snakeskin on the floor. The fourth had been almost exactly what I had been hoping to see and show him. The path was steep. It was steep going down, and it would be that way going back up again, but it was worth all the sweating and grunting. And the cave, when we finally reached it, was nearly the size of our home. Little alleyways that jutted off here and there that never went so far for a person to become lost in, but deeply enough that you could explore them and be filled with wonder at what might be just around the next corner. We traced indentions on the walls with our fingers, and we listened to the echoes of our voices. We took photos, and I pretended to be a caveman, complete with all the grunting and fist thumping on my chest. Well, they laughed and laughed at that until I grabbed my wife by the hair and tried to drag her across the room like a caveman theoretically might drag his woman. She didn't dig it, not at all. She also didn't dig the blisters she was getting on the backs of her ankles from her tennis shoes instead of her more supportive footwear that I had suggested she wear. And when she was back at the top of the ridge in obvious discomfort, I knew enough to know that it was not the time for an old "I told you so." I suggested that we pack it in for the day and try to find one or two more caves the next morning before we headed back home. Well, she had a different plan in mind. I should have gone with my plan, but her plan turned out to be another "I told you so" that I will never bring up for as long as I live. My wife's plan was to go back to where we were camped and sit for a couple of hours with her shoes off before starting to throw things together for our supper, while Britt and I went on and had our fill of cave discovering. And when we returned, we would all have a great meal and enjoy each other's company before turning in, and we could get an early start back the next morning. Britt and I watched her walk away, favoring her steps as she took them. We agreed that we would only explore one more cave. The other 8 or so on the map could wait until another time for a part 2 of this experience. She was almost out of sight when she turned and blew us both a kiss. It turned out to be nearly half a mile long walk to get to where we should start looking for the next and our final cave of the trip. We had given the cave that we had searched for a thorough looking at, and when we emerged finally, I noticed that the sun was lower than I had expected it to be. I told Britt that we needed to hurry and not take any chances with her mother's mood. She agreed, and we both moved the march up to double time. We were hustling. We were having fun together still, but we were definitely hustling through and around the trees. That was when, in a bit of an out-of-breath voice, she told me to stop growling at her. She didn't think it was funny, and it made me seem immature to try to scare her. Well, I didn't know what she was talking about. I just assumed that she had heard something she didn't recognize, and she blamed it on me. Well, she was tearful when she demanded that I stop making the noises the next time she spoke. I swore to her that I had done nothing and was just before giving her one of those hugs that only fathers know how to give daughters to make everything okay again when we both heard the growling. It came from behind us. She had called it growling, but that really wasn't what it was. It wasn't to my ears anyway. It came again, like thunder from a building storm rolling across the valley and heading our way. But unlike thunder, this sound had an urgency or an intensity to it. But it was not a growling. It was a roar or a bellow. It was a primal scream. It was an announcing of a presence and an awareness that it knew where we were, that we were somewhere we should not be, and we were interlopers in a place that tolerated no interlopers. Britt looked at me, and the few freckles she had across the bridge of her nose had all but disappeared because her face had grown so pale. She was looking to me for an answer, for reassurance, for confidence that everything was going to be just fine. I looked her in the eyes and I lied to her. I told her that we had probably gotten the attention of a wandering bear or perhaps a bobcat, I didn't know what was making those terrible sounds, but I was sure that it wasn't what I had suggested. My only thought at the time was calming my daughter, and I would have told her anything at the time. So I took her by the hand and I told her that we needed to hurry. It was going to start getting dark soon, and animals tended to hunt and roam around more at night. The lie seemed to work, and we took off, not in a panicked run, but much faster than a walk. We didn't hear more roaring as we moved through the darkening woods, and we felt better. We didn't start running until after the section of tree limb, as big as my leg, came flying through the air and caught me flush in the back. She kept asking me what had happened and what was wrong and was I all right. And I wanted to answer, but I wanted to breathe more. And every ounce of air had been driven out of my lungs. We needed to move, but I needed to breathe first. I knew I should be calm and the breath would return, but I was in a panic mode, and the harder I struggled to breathe, the farther away the air seemed. We could hear crashing of tree limbs snapping, and I was holding Britt tight against me so she wouldn't look around. I couldn't see anything. I didn't want her to see anything if something appeared. I held her tightly and stared into the dusky trees while my chest slowly filled the air again. Like a lifelong chain smoker, I could hear its heavy breathing. I needed her to run. I pushed her away from my chest and I took off running with her hand in mine. And she understood and she didn't argue. We ran and we stumbled and we skidded and slipped and we straddled small saplings and we took I don't know how many limbs to our faces, but we never stopped running. We might have slowed down once we thought we had put enough distance between us and whatever was behind us, but the roaring began again, and somehow it didn't sound like it did earlier. Now it sounded enraged, like running from it had been an insult. It was angry, and I didn't want to see it when it was angry. We ran even faster with no idea where we were going. We only knew that we had to get away. She was crying, and her free hand pressed against her side where the stitch was clutching her insides, but she kept up with me. And then a rock the size of a cantaloupe missiled through the air just over our heads and crashed loudly against a tree. And whatever was behind us roared the loudest that it had up until that point, probably angry that it had missed us with its throw. And we ran even harder. And then I fell and dragged my daughter right along with me. I didn't know that I had been unconscious. My daughter was slapping my cheek, and crying and screaming at all the same time. I tried to make the fog clear from my mind, but I couldn't. I had no idea where I was or what was going on. All I knew was that there seemed to be noise everywhere, and I needed everything to just be quiet for a few minutes so that I could think and come back to my senses. At least when I opened my eyes, my daughter stopped smacking me. It felt better when she stopped. And everything else hurt, but at least my cheek wasn't stinging any longer. Dirt and leaves and small sticks and tiny rocks kept falling onto us. They were annoying when they landed on my face, and I wanted to brush them away, but I knew better than to turn loose of Britt. She wasn't ready to let go of me yet. And my eyesight had cleared and my head had stopped spinning around and around, but I still couldn't see very much. It was so dang dark. The noise of the roaring was louder than ever before, and it seemed to be falling down on us. And I twisted my head a little and I looked straight up, and then I saw it. It was the most massive thing I had ever seen. Massive as in a collection of muscles and power and all attached to a gigantic hair or fur-covered frame. Long arms that flexed and bulged and that had enormous leathery-looking hands at the ends. Hands that kept clenching and unclenching as if they were imagining how it wanted to grab each of us. Its chest was covered with long, coarse-looking hair, but when it turned in certain ways, I could see scars on its chest where the hair wouldn't grow. This was a creature that was used to fighting, and probably winning. Maybe because I was lying flat on my back, but the thing towered to what looked to me to be 8, maybe even 10 feet high. No matter the measurement, it was enormous. A giant, bellowing, hair-covered thing from a scary children's story, except this actually existed, and it was standing there looking down at me and my daughter. It would raise one or the other of its legs and stomp a foot down against the ground when it roared and bellowed. The thighs on whatever this thing was that loomed over our heads were huge and thick. They would quiver and ripple each time it thundered one of those great, long, grotesque feet against the ground. It had a head as big as a cow's head, or so it seemed to me. It was brutish and ugly, and deep hate filled its eyes. They sat too close to the bridge of its blunt, almost non-existent nose. But the teeth, they were what frightened me. They were yellow and thick and blunted and strong-looking and difficult to chip or break was my guess. And the drool ran in streams out of that mouth as it stared down at us and it roared. Maybe we were safe for the minute. There was a distance between us, and the creature didn't seem to want to close that distance, at least not for the moment. We had fallen into one of those caves. I don't remember if this one had been on the map or if we had happened to discover a new one. That didn't matter. It was here, and we had fallen into it. And I reached for the flashlight that was zipped into one of my pockets of my cargo pants. The pain nearly caused me to pass out again. Something was terribly wrong with my shoulder or my upper back. To have fallen and landed more or less on my back on a rock surface, and it's no wonder I saw stars before I saw nothing for a while. And I managed to get my flashlight out and on, and then I breathed deeply and slowly for a few breaths while the pain tamed down again. And as long as I didn't move, it wasn't so bad, but moving made it awful. The cave we had fallen into was not like the others we had visited earlier in the day. This one was shaped more like a well, a giant round hole in the earth that happened to have ledges here and there. And fortunately, the one we had fallen into was large enough to hold both Britt and me. I shined the light below us, and I could see the floor of the cave, but it was at least as far away from us as the top was from us. We were pretty well in the middle. What I couldn't see were any more ledges below us, and I could see no openings down below where an escape from the cave might be possible. And as far as I could tell, the only way out was up, and that thing up there screaming its bloody head off couldn't wait for us to try that. But all of that was nothing compared to the problem I saw next. Britt had been quiet ever since she had roused me back awake. I figured she was trying to shut herself off from all that was endangering us, but I saw that she was very pale and that she was unconscious. I started to jiggle her to wake her up from where she had fainted. I saw a couple of scuffs on her cheek and hand, but nothing serious, and then I shined the light further down. The bottom of her shorts leg was bloody, and so was the rest of her leg. Her leg was bent at an unnatural angle below the knee, and further up I felt the bone of her thigh where it had pierced through after it had broken. I had no idea how badly I had been hurt, but I knew that at the very least my daughter had broken her leg in 2 places, and one of those breaks was causing her to lose blood. Every move I made felt like getting hit in the back with a pillowcase full of doorknobs, but it could have been 10 times worse, and it still wasn't going to stop me from helping my daughter if I could. I ended up using my shirt as a bandage around her leg and my shoelaces to keep it tied down tight. Thankfully, the scratched and upper break were close enough together so that the bandage I made covered both of them. And I fastened my belt around the lower break to try to keep it as immobile as I could. I know very little about first aid and even less when it comes to dealing with trauma, so I didn't know if I was doing right or not, but I did all that I could think to do. That was when I was trying the last of my shoelaces around her leg that she woke up. She didn't scream or ask what I was doing. She just cried. The more that thing up above us roared, the more she cried, and I didn't blame her. I shined my light on the creature's face. Now that did two things that I was not expecting. I saw that it was even uglier and more terrifying than I had originally believed it to be. And it made the creature furious, and it screamed louder, and it stomped harder, and finally it darted back from the opening, only to return with sticks and chunks of wood to throw down at us. I took several cuts and gashes to my hands and wrists, but I managed to keep any of the debris from hitting Britt. All I could do was cover her body with my own as best as I could when the thing threw a log, or at least a long section of one, at us. It threw it like it was a spear, even though it was as big around as my leg, and it went wayward on the way down and began bouncing off the cave wall. And when it finally landed, it was wedged or bouncing between the opposite wall of the cave and the ledge that we were stranded on. In its effort to kill us, the thing up above us had given us a way to escape. The problem was that it was still up there waiting. We didn't have the time to wait on it to grow bored and walk away. I had to do something. I told my daughter that she was to lie still and not make any noises no matter what. The size of her eyes told me that she was scared to death, but she nodded in understanding of what I had told her. I needed to get the log that the thing had thrown at us off the opposite wall and propped up on the ledge that we were on so I could lean it against the top of the cave and use it as a ladder. It was going to be a hard climb, but the walls of the cave were going to be impossible, so I was going to take what I could get. What I was going to do at the top with that thing still up there was beyond me, but going while it was there was sure death. But I couldn't keep waiting while my daughter needed medical attention. At first, nothing happened when I pulled against the log. Nothing except the pain that made a million white stars appear before my eyes. I pulled again and I felt the log twist free from the wall. I was pulling as hard as I could to get it to stand upright. I was sweating and wanting to scream because of the fire burning in my back from the pain. But I kept pulling and eventually saw it coming up and getting straighter. But I had not propped the bottom of the log against the wall as I should have, and it twisted and began to fall off the ledge that we were suspended on. And I screamed as it slid through my hands toward the bottom of the cave, and the creature screamed because it was still angry, and Britt screamed in spite of herself because she had never heard her father scream from terror and pain before. The log kept sliding through my hands, and I kept trying to hold it tighter. And then it stopped so suddenly that I very nearly went over the edge. I was on my knees and holding on to the final 2 feet of the log. I couldn't let go to look, but I felt blood running through my knuckles from where the wood had burned and scraped some of the flesh from my palms away as it slid. I held on to the log and allowed it to swing slowly back and forth like an immense pendulum while I held to it and I caught my breath. Dirt kept falling on us from where the creature was stomping around on the edge, and then it kept roaring at us. Slowly, inch by valuable inch, I pulled the log up from the darkness below until I could rest it against the wall and slide it upward. It took everything I had, more pain than I knew I could endure, but finally the log was upright and all ours. It would not be easy, but I would be able to use it to climb out of this pit and then rescue my daughter, as soon as I figured out what to do with the monster above that was waiting for us. We needed to make something happen. I don't think the creature had the brain power to understand what I was going to attempt. I think it was just beside itself with rage and lashing out at anything it could. But as soon as I started to try shimmying up that log, it tried to reach down into the cave and started swatting at the log. It was too far away and too deep for the creature to touch it, but it kept flailing at the log. It swatted with every ounce of energy it had, and that energy, along with its blind rage and hatred, caused the creature to swing too hard, and it tried to reach too far. It lost its balance and began to tumble off the crumbling edge of the cave entrance, and it clawed and scrambled and howled, but it kept falling. It was reaching out at us as it went past us, and it plunged to be trapped at the bottom of the cave, and it still tried its very best to take one or both of us with it as it went. The cave trembled from the outrage and the desperate roars coming from below us, and we never looked down at the creature once. Britt begged me to allow her to wrap her arms around my neck so that she could ride on my back as I climbed my way up the log and out of the cave. Climbing out was going to be near impossible for me as it was, and I would not be able to do it carrying her weight as well. I would get to the top, and with luck that we surely were due, I would get out, and then I would pull the log out while she held on to it. I got her up as carefully as I could, and I made sure that she had firm grips on the log. I told her to allow the log to support her weight, and she didn't need to worry about doing that. And then I took her belt off of her, and I draped it around my neck. I was glad that she could not see the tears in my eyes from the pain that I was in. It felt like several knives had been stabbed into my upper back, but I kept climbing, and I didn't stop. And with each pull, I knew I was getting us that much closer to help and away from that thing that continued to roar below us. It was tedious and beyond painful, but at last I began to feel fresh air from the slight breeze blowing through the trees. I groaned a lot, and I cursed a little as I made the last of the climb, and then I rolled myself over the lip of the cave, and I lay there in the leaves trying to breathe. I told Brett that I was okay, or would be in just a minute, and that she would be out of there in no time. The belt was wrapped around my hand, and I began to pull once I had gotten back onto my knees. It was a harder pull than I had anticipated, but the log was moving, and that was all I cared about. And the air smelled foul from where the creature had raged and ranted, and so I breathed through my mouth, and I pulled as hard as I could. I've been fortunate to see many beautiful things in my life, but my daughter's face as she neared the entrance to the cursed cave was almost the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It hurt her to be jostled around, but she didn't complain as I pulled her free from the dark hole that was nearly a grave as well as a cave. I still had the map I had been carrying in my pocket. It took me a bit to try to do some mental backtracking so I could at least have an idea where we were. We had been running with no direction in mind when we fell, so it was just a guess as to where we ended up. And like I had supposed earlier, the cave we had fallen into was not one that my guy knew about. I felt pretty good about where we needed to head toward, and everything else felt terrible. But I scooped Britt up in my arms and started walking. The roar from the bottom of that well-shaped cave began to fade, and when I could no longer hear it, it was the best sound I could not hear. It took more than 2 hours and several stops for rest before we saw the flickers from the campfire Jan had built hours earlier. When we called out to her, she came running with that famous rage of her own. But that went away immediately after she saw how damaged we were. I told her that I had Britt under control, but she should go and start making a place for our daughter to lay down in the back seat. While we packed everything in a rush and made sure that the fire was out, I explained our daughter's condition to the extent that I knew it. Only after seeing me double over in pain and fall into a knee did she realize that our daughter was not the only one who had been injured. And that was when she wanted to know exactly what had happened to us out there. I promised her that I would tell her everything, but I wasn't going to go into it all until I knew that Britt was safe and being taken care of. She offered to drive, but I knew she wanted to sit in the back seat with her arms around Britt, so I told her that I would be fine after I was sitting down. It was a bold-faced lie, but she believed me and we started the car. The road out was rougher than I remembered it being, or maybe I couldn't see to dodge the holes and ruts so well in the dark, but either way it was hard on me getting out of there. I didn't say anything, but I was sweating a cold sweat from the pain and was keeping a white-knuckle grip on a steering wheel, and my vision was blurred with fatigue and sweat. I knew everything would be better once we were on a maintained road. I just had to make it that far, and I didn't. I took the last turn too sharp and didn't straighten out in time to miss the ditch. The car kept going just like a trooper, but it ran into the highway marker sign across the road and stopped. I had not seen or felt it do that. The last big jolt had caused me to lose consciousness again. In the hospital, Jan told me that I had blacked out for about 10 minutes before a couple of men stopped in their pickup truck to be of help. They had called a friend of theirs to come with his rollback after they had called an ambulance. The ambulance took me and my wife and our daughter to the nearest hospital while the men loaded our wounded car on the rollback to take to a shop. Jan called a friend of hers the next day who stopped by our house and brought some clothing and other things. And when the friend arrived, I was in traction, my daughter was in a cast the length of her leg, and my wife was the angriest I had ever known her to be. She wasn't mad about the car, not really, and she wasn't mad at me for what had befallen me and our daughter. Well, maybe she was angry at me some. But being angry is Jan's way of not showing when she's terrified about something. It had been the middle of the morning before we had some quiet time where I could tell her what had happened. And it made her so angry also because I wouldn't tell her the truth, but she was a bit nicer after she came back to my room. She had been talking with Britt and heard that all I had said had not been made up. We're back home now after several days under constant physician care. And Britt has become quite the hot rod in her wheelchair that she'll have to use for another few weeks. I don't think the girls will allow me to plan any more of the monthly adventures. And sometimes I wonder if that creature is still roaring at the bottom of that cave. As bad as it was to us and as close as it came to killing my daughter and me, a part of me hopes that it somehow found a way out of that cave. I don't ever want to be within 10 miles of that thing again, but I don't think I want it to have died either. We're safe now, so I guess let bygones be bygones as far as I'm concerned.